You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is Edward Chisholm, whose debut novel, A Waiter in Paris, Adventures in the Dark Heart of the City, has received international recognition and was named Book of the Week by the Daily Mail and one of the best books of 2022 by the New York Post. Edward has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, Telegraph Weekend Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times Magazine, among others. He was also chosen to be one of 8 screenwriters to attend the Cannes Series Institute Writers' Residency. A Waiter in Paris is based on Edward's time as, well, a waiter in Paris, a job he threw himself into when he found himself alone, nearly penniless, and speaking only the most rudimentary French. It's a look into the seedy underbelly of a city so often viewed through rose-colored glasses. Please allow me to introduce Edward Chisholm, author of A Waiter in Paris, Adventures in the Dark Heart of the City. Hello, Edward. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to just chatting.
Me too. Before we dive in, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name is Edward Chisholm. I'm the author of A Waiter in Paris, Adventures in the Dark Heart of the City, which is a book that was published last year in English in the UK and North America, Canada, Australia, all around the world. Currently being translated into Chinese, rather excitingly. And yes, I work as a writer, essentially.
Fabulous. So normally I ask people what their connection to France is, and then I ask them what their book is about, but I think I can probably combine those two into one question.
Yes, it's probably quite obvious. So, well, what brought me to France, I guess, is probably an easier answer to give. Like many good stories, there's a French girl involved, which is actually where the book begins, although she then soon, like many French people or Parisians, moved off to London, at which point I decided I wanted to stay, having fallen under the charms of Paris. And yeah, that's kind of where it began. And so I lived there for 7 years, I think, in total in Paris. Left a few years ago now, 3 years ago.
Do you miss it?
I do miss some aspects. I'm not too far away, so I can go regularly. And the nice thing is, basically, we'll always have Paris, right? It's just this saying Casablanca, but it's there and it's nice now because when I do go, I just take the best bits, the bits that, I really want. But I do love it. It will always hold a part in my heart, really, I think.
That actually leads me to one of the questions I was going to ask you, which is, in your coming to Paris, you experienced a much grittier side of Paris than most people experience or think about or dream about when they dream of coming here. When you think about Paris now, are you able to appreciate the rosier, more romantic stereotypes, or do you find yourself always seeing that gritty underbelly?
No, I reject wholly all these stereotypes, any stereotypes really. And I think Paris deserves better than the stereotype. But it's true, the story I recount on my story is kind of the antithesis to the traditional move to Paris, fall in love, get a nice, cute job and swan around the Marais and expensive haute couture clothing. I mean, the reality for most people isn't like that. The moving abroad is difficult. It's fraught with problems. The language probably being the first one, the fact that you don't know anybody second, and then all these different cultural things. London and Paris aren't so far away. There's a train that takes a few hours, but it's vast as an ocean the way you live in the two different cities. So you find yourself, even in my situation, completely lost. So, when I like Paris for its rough edges and its imperfections, like people, and I think the sort of over-polished fictional version that I kind of want to look at in the book, that doesn't really exist. It exists a little bit in these very central areas, but it's a kind of antiseptic version, isn't it? It's too clean. Rarely are places like this. It's like a 5-star hotel. It looks very beautiful, but it's kind of an artificial luxury, isn't it?
That's true. And I do think that there's a difference between visiting someplace and living there. And you move here oftentimes because you fall in love with Paris is beautiful and it has a beautiful magic energy to it.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But then after a while, like I feel like there's a time that comes like 2 or 3 years in where you just really fall madly out of love with Paris and you start to not like it and resent it and only see the worst of it. And then like when you come back around, you're experiencing real Paris.
Yeah, I can't remember it. I should look it up. There's a quote by Paul Bowles, the author, who says something about, the tourist sort of skims along the surface, and it's only the person who lives there who really sinks in and gets under that surface. And it's very true. You're no longer visiting. But there's something else, isn't there? As you say, like it's a bit like a relationship. At the beginning, there's lots of excitement and passion. It's very novel, and it's everything you want it to be and more. You're in love with the idea almost. And Paris, everyone has their own Paris. Paris is an idea, actually. We all have our own Paris. And so when we get there, we kind of go looking for it, I guess. We want that confirmed. It's so easy because it is so beautiful. And you can walk down streets which you recognize from famous paintings or famous films or whatever. Like it's culturally so rich. But yeah, that wears off after a few years once you start to get into the, horrors of administration and bureaucracy or dealing with URSAF, all these kind of things, which really do take a toll. Or just, as the French say, sort of general incivility in certain parts of their life in living in Paris. But that also brings the color, that brings the joy, that brings the diversity.
Yeah, I was talking about that with a friend recently about how all the strikes here in Paris, they're designed in large part to annoy you because the more inconvenient they are, the more effective they are. But I also find that really charming that they do it on purpose that way. I don't know if it's a reverse psychology, but I like it now.
Yeah, and there's something, it's weird, isn't it? When I was living in London, there was like a strike, which is very rare, although these days apparently quite more common. In Paris, you kind of just go with the flow. It's part of the ebb and flow of the city, right, of its life. So there's a strike here, there's this happening, there's a huge march. You can't cut across half the city. You have to take some huge protracted route. But life goes on, and I think that is still part of the charm of it, isn't it? If you're somebody who's looking for very easy living, obviously Paris isn't probably the best place unless you've got lots of money. Probably better off moving to Switzerland or Norway or something. But yeah, you don't want to go to Paris looking for the perfect version.
No.
You want to go and find your real Paris, your gritty Paris.
So can you describe to us a little bit the premise of the book, the theme of the book?
Yeah, so I guess the main cliche in the book is that I wanted to be a writer when I arrived in Paris, but I had no idea what that meant and how you go about it. It didn't come from a family of, book readers or anything like that. So it was a kind of a vague notions of wanting to do that. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I assumed I'd be able to learn the language. I assumed the fact that I spoke English might help. That I had a degree from university or college might help. And then I quickly found out that no, it doesn't really help at all. In France, they're very linear about the jobs they do after the specific studies they've done. And maybe it's changing a little bit now, but the idea of transferable skills kind of doesn't compute with them. They need to what they call encadrer, like put you in a frame. They need to be able to frame you, understand who you are. So it was really, really hard to get a job, and I didn't speak French. And just sort of little by little, as I was running out of money and time, I sort of went down the kind of types of jobs until I got to the more menial jobs. It happened quite quickly. I was quite surprised. And even they weren't taking me. And eventually I got a job in a restaurant as a waiter. I sort of said to myself, well, this is Paris. It's a city which is, known for cuisine and restaurants, and waiters are ubiquitous. Surely I can become a waiter. And then the book's about that. It's about me trying to become a waiter, but it's also a kind of portrait of Paris and an homage to these people, these incredibly diverse people who work in this industry, this iconic industry in Paris. You've never been written about before, really. I mean, the only time I'd really come across them in literature was in Down and Out in Paris by George Orwell. And he's writing about his experiences in the sort of late 1920s. And it's a book that I loved. It was one of the books that really sort of marked me as a teenager. And what I found very quickly when I was working in the restaurant is that very little had changed in the descriptions that Orwell's giving. Not just the restaurant, but the living conditions where I was living, all these things were kind of the same. And I'd never intended to write a book about working in a restaurant. I assumed I'd write the next great novel. But when you work in a restaurant, you have no life, no time, nothing, you're exhausted. And so, yeah, it was actually many years later, I found that when I was describing Paris, describing France to people, I'd often come back to the restaurant as a metaphor to sort of help me explain. It seemed to be quite a useful metaphor for helping to explain Paris and by extension France. And so, that's kind of where the idea of the book came from. And originally I wanted to do something fictional, and I was sort of persuaded to go the non-fiction route.
Okay, so I read this book, and after having read it, I know that you could not possibly have time to take notes while you were doing this or kept a journal or anything like that. So when you were writing this book or when you were rewriting it, or even now when you talk about it, when you go back and relive that time in your mind, what is that experience like for you?
Yeah, I mean, so the funny thing was, so when I was working in the job, I didn't have time. I wasn't taking notes about this. I wasn't documenting it like a documentary. I wasn't there for that. But the experience was so potent and so different to anything I'd lived. And even when it was really tough, it was just incredibly vivid. I discovered also, I don't want to sound conceited, but I have quite a good memory, or kind of photographic, if you will. I have a good attention for detail, I guess, especially but I think also when you're in these situations, which are so new, so novel, all of your like synapses are on fire. You're sort of struggling to survive and therefore just absorbing it. And so going back and reliving it was interesting. I mean, I started writing it at a time when things weren't so great for me. And I was at the end of my 20s, and I was thinking like, oh, I've really messed up. Like, what was it all for? Have I made a big mistake? And so it gave me a chance to go back and look at this early time and be like, wow, did that have an impact on me? Am I now stuck in, because of working so many years in these kind of low grade jobs, I guess, will I ever get out? And then since then, things have changed and evolved. So now I look back at it with affection. But I remember at the time of writing, it's something quite anxiety giving about, because, when you're in your 20s, you're trying to work out what to do with your life. And there's no roadmap if you don't go and work a traditional career. If you find yourself as a waiter in Paris and you don't speak French, you've really gone quite far off road. So you do ask yourself a lot of questions, but I'm proud of to have done that now. It's made me a more rounded and hopefully more interesting person, I guess.
It's funny what you say, about being hyper aware of things. I wonder if it's a bit like how they describe being blind, where your other senses are heightened, because you were sort of mute, like you couldn't really speak the language. So you had to pay attention to all of the other different cues and things to really understand what was happening. Yeah,
totally. And I always, in fact, it was recently I was reading John le Carre actually, and he was talking about like spies and his young spy. And it's funny because a lot of it resonated with how I was thinking of my experience, because I was kind of deaf mute to these people. Well, not deaf, but mute. They didn't have any idea. I couldn't really, communicate properly. I think that people sort of forgot I was there or assumed I was pretty stupid, because to see like a 22-year-old who can't understand really basic stuff that like a French dog could understand, or like a French 1-year-old, they're just thinking, what is wrong with this guy? And so that made me into a kind of observer, a non-threatening observer. They just assume, this idiot's standing around and hopefully we can get him to pick up these dirty plates if we keep pointing and shouting at him and the plates, and he'll put two and two together. So yes, so because of that, and as you say, you're listening to sentences, you're trying to catch words, and I think that's why I enjoyed it so much as well, is that after years, at university, you become a bit, I don't know, we live quite easy lives in the West, really, especially as students and things, and we assume it's all given to us, we'll get a job and all that kind of stuff. And suddenly you find out that's not true. You've fallen out at the bottom of your kind of perceived version of society, and you've got to fight to survive. And suddenly your brain's working, and it's capable of a lot more than you imagine. Like learning French, for example, which I thought I would never do.
How's your French now?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fluent, so that's good. I still have a nice English accent, but I've decided to stop fighting that.
It's charming, isn't it?
Part of the charm, apparently, yeah.
Do you think that the experiences that you had in this restaurant here in Paris are indicative of restaurants? You said sort of that it was like a metaphor for how life is in France. How do you think it's different from working in a restaurant in a different part of the world?
Well, that's what's been really interesting with the people that have contacted me who have read the book, is because my understanding is this is a fairly universal experience. Like the job of a waiter is quite universal, unlike a cook or a chef, which is quite specialized, really. A waiter is a sort of transient job, and it's a job that's done all over the world by people sort of in different situations. And so what I was amazed to hear is from people writing to me, from New York, who were waiters in the 70s, or, somebody who was saying they had a similar experience in Rome in the 90s, and or Australia and New Zealand and India and all these places. And they all say like, the characters I described in the book, they had their own versions of those, in their own restaurants. And so that's been like wonderful to know that even describing this experience, I've created something which speaks to a kind of greater sort of situation. But obviously then again, this isn't every single restaurant. This isn't every single restaurant in France or Paris or France or Europe or whatever. So there are many different types of restaurants. There are many different types of people who work in them. But there is something universal about the description, I hope, in this book, which makes it kind of relatable, regardless of where you are.
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. It's interesting. I started off as an actress, so obviously I was a waitress.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a job we do while we're waiting for something else, funnily enough.
I mean, exactly. Yeah, so I waited tables in New York and in LA, and a lot of the characters that you describe are ones that not the same, but ones that I could imagine. The thing that struck me as so different, though, is that it always felt in the places that I worked like the wait staff was part of the same team, and it wasn't so combative and competitive between them the way that you describe it in your book.
Yeah, I mean, that's the funny thing. There was a great sense of camaraderie between the waiters, but, you know, it's a job which isn't secure. Someone can quickly take your place. You know, if you start complaining that you're working ridiculous hours, which you are by virtue of being a waiter, you know, they're not going to sack you, but they'll start cutting your hours down until it becomes untenable and you have to leave. And also, you know, there's people coming into the restaurant every single day with their CV and dropping them off. So you're just being confronted with your replacements. So, you know, you're also being paid the legal minimum wage to survive in that city. Most people aspire more to simple survival in life. So then you're sort of competing for the tips because tips are quite important. That's what makes the difference. There's a weird dynamic of sort of camaraderie and competition. But like any company or business or even family, it's like you get these sort of cliques or groups that sort of form and have mutual interests. And there's power dynamics, you know, with the people who are higher up the food chain and those lower down who want to come up. So yeah, it creates quite an unusual environment. And this is all going on whilst you as a diner are just eating, right? You're just assuming it's just a waiter. He goes or she goes back, brings some food back, and that's it. But all this is happening, right? Behind the scenes, but also in front of the scenes, above your heads, you know, just as they swoosh around with these big silver trays.
It certainly made me think about smoking breaks differently because It's sort of a universal experience to be at a restaurant here and see your waiter standing in front of you smoking a cigarette, ignoring you while you want something.
Yeah. No, and
now I sort of appreciate it.
And then you also wonder, like, did he wash his hands afterwards? Yeah, it was integral. As one of the guys in the book says to me, he's like, you know, smoking is freedom. And he was right, because if I'd gone to the management and said, hey, do you mind if I just sort of go outside and sit down for a second? They'd be like, are you joking? We're paying you to work. Whereas if you say, do you mind if I go outside for a smoke? They're like, of course, if anything, you understand. And later on, I had a job in an advertising agency, and I had to go for a medical. Part of your, every year you have to go and get checked by the sort of company doctor. And there's this old guy, and he asked if I smoked, and I said, well, a little bit. He's like, okay, that's good. And I was like, this is kind of weird. And he's like, no, that's good, because at least it means you get up and go outside and have a little bit of fresh air. He said there's fresh air, a little walk around. And this kind of stuff people just don't think you'd ever hear. And it sounds like it's something in a comedy or whatever. But that just sort of shows you the sort of French relationship with smoking. It's much different. Like, there are so many more people in Paris smoke than in London and New York now. Even young people, it's still like much more part of the culture.
Yeah, I've told this story before, but I know someone who went to New York, a French person who was obviously an avid smoker, went there and was so humiliated, so shamed that she completely stopped smoking forever.
It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah.
People would just like cough at her, and she was so embarrassed and she felt so mortified. And also, like, they made her feel like she was poisoning them, and she was like,
yeah. Oh God. Yeah. I guess these days, what will the waiters do for breaks now then, I guess? Take some CBD drops or something, or whatever. Or
vaping.
Or
awful.
Probably just scrolling on a phone, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned the customers, and your book really focuses more on the inner workings of the restaurant and the relationships between the staff. But one of your readers asked a question that I thought was really compelling, which is, so there's this stereotype that waiters in Paris are rude. How much of that do you think is true? And how much of that do you think is like playing up to the stereotype?
That is quite a good question, actually, because and one of the sort of themes of the book is this notion of performance and the dining room being a little bit of a stage, or the city is a stage, a kind of performance. And so you do get a certain part of the waiter's role, in the sense of an acting role, is to be, a little bit grumpy, a little bit gruff with you. And in a sense, that's kind of what you want. You're going to a French restaurant, you kind of want to get the full experience. But then on the flip side, he's probably, or she's probably been on her feet since like, I don't know, whatever time, hasn't had lunch, has just had, one of her colleagues hasn't turned up. So she's now doing like twice as many tables. People are shouting at her all, front, back and left and right, clients, diners, sous chefs, whatever, people at the past, managers. So, and you often as a foreigner, probably, I guess people listening to this podcast, want to practice your French or something, bonjour, je voudrais, whatever. They don't have time for this at all. Like, that's not what they're there for. So naturally they'll be even shorter with you. So yeah, I think it's a bit of both, really. Don't judge them too harshly.
Do you find that people would tip you better or worse if you were friendlier or more rude?
Well, I was quite bad at being a grumpy French waiter, but at the beginning I came across as one because I just ignored people on purpose because I couldn't speak French or understand them. So that I must have been like a really French waiter at that point. But later on, it's funny talking about like playing roles. Like later on, I would sometimes pretend to be a French waiter speaking English, to foreign tourists, because they would kind of be disappointed if I was just an English guy speaking English. So I'd purposefully speak like a French person. Yes, maybe you have chosen. It is coming very soon. I speak with the chef, and I don't think twice. I don't think for a minute you're an English guy. Sometimes you'd speak to people in English with this accent, and they would just assume you were French because they weren't even trying to imagine it wasn't the case. So yeah, I was always quite friendly and sort of eventually just played up to the fact that I was an English waiter, which seemed to, the French people found it quite funny. And the tourists, I'd just pretend to be French.
I mean, it's clever, right? That's what they want.
Well, exactly. That's, you got to play the game.
I have had people here, though, tell me that my English is very good, which,
oh, really?
which yeah. I mean is a compliment, but also
you speak. Yeah, they say how long? It's good. Yeah, how long have you been doing it? You're like, well, at that time I'd be like, well, I've been practicing for 22 years.
I know, and every time someone asks me if I'm fluent in French, I say yes, but like I've been speaking it significantly.
Yeah.
For a significantly shorter amount of time than I have English, so the fluency is not the same.
No, of course, yeah. It's never gonna. As comfortable as you are in a second language, you're never, well, unless you're born, I guess, bilingual or trilingual. It's hard to get to that level, isn't it?
Yeah. Damn my parents.
Yes.
So I imagine that everyone is sort of obsessed with your eating habits now.
Really?
Do people ask you all the time, like, do you go to restaurants and do you eat out?
Yeah. In that sense, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it's one of the really, really common questions is like, should I go to a restaurant? How do I know? I mean, I don't have any super unique advice that's going to, revolutionize how you eat out, apart from the kind of ordinary things, isn't it? It's we have a lot of information at our fingertips online, but there's a time to get off Google reviews and just ask some people in the street. You'd probably be surprised that the person in the bar who's working there will know a good restaurant to eat in. Just ask her and be like, hey, do you know a good restaurant? I'm like, yeah, there's a great restaurant on it. That way you don't have to wade through these comments, of like how many stars. But apart from that, it's the usual things, isn't it? If the menu's massive, that's a pretty bad sign because no kitchen can churn out that much stuff without cutting a lot of corners. If you can see into the kitchen, it helps. If it's a regular daily changing menu, it helps. If it's, as I said in the book, never pay for the view. You're just being shafted, basically. You're not eating well in these places. Avoid the tourist traps, venture out a little bit, accept that sometimes you might make a mistake and it might go wrong, but it's an adventure. It's part of it. And and discuss with your waiter, like have a rapport with your waiter and they'll point you in the direction of good things on the menu, which you might not have usually ordered. And, when I go out, I try not to eat things that I'm not going to cook at home. So you go for the more elaborate dishes.
Yeah, it always makes sense to make friends with your waiter because they will steer you right or wrong.
And right, I never understand why people are rude to their waiter. This is the thing that sort of still mystifies me. Like, you are entrusting this person to bring you something from an unknown place, which you're then going to consume, and you're being rude to them, calling them a shit or whatever. Like, that's so short-sighted. You can't expect good things to come out of that.
Yeah, if you don't think people are going to tamper with that, you are naive.
No. It's incredibly naive.
So my favorite part of the book is the connections that you make between the different people the waitstaff who become your friends and a bit like family. You're in the trenches together.
Yes.
And you update us a bit at the end of the book, but I'm wondering if anything has changed since, if you have reconnected with any of these people, if any of them have read the book.
Well, for the moment, the book isn't in French, so that sort of limits the chances of them reading it. I know I'll sort of avoid using names, also in case I use the real names. I know one of the people in the book has been in contact and has read the book and found it to be a good experience, a good sort of positive recollection. Although surprised, obviously, that I was sort of at the time, this was being recorded in my mind. And then, for the moment, that's about it, really. And kind of like I say in the book, it's funny how you work so tightly together, so closely, and you form these quite intense but unusual relationships because they're kind of out of time. They live in their own sort of temporal environment. They live in the kitchen time and the restaurant time. You don't really see each other outside of the restaurant much, a little bit, because rarely are you both off or all off at the same time. Because if you're off, that means someone else is working. And as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, 1 minute they're there, 1 minute they're gone. They've gone to another city, different country. They've moved to a different restaurant. Their allegiances are with them. And so I was always a little bit sad at how we just sort of drop out. And you might try and contact them, and you might find a few months later a moment to have a beer, but it's kind of suddenly changed. You're no longer, a little bit like when you move abroad and you go back and see old friends. There's sort of a lull in the conversation because you don't have those sort of day-to-day things to talk about. But yeah, as I said in the end of the book, I won't sort of ruin it, but I did find out a little bit about some of the people, even from a distance. And in fact, one of them actually, I realized, I Googled again because I get the question, and he has changed jobs. So he's no longer a waiter. This is Lucien. He's actually, he's changed, which is quite, heartwarming.
Is he doing what he wanted to do?
He is not, no, but he is working as, I guess, like an estate agent would be.
Okay.
Which is a certain kind of acting, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But
certainly more prestige.
Yes, and more regular paychecks, I guess.
Yes, that too. So I have a bonus question for you.
Go ahead.
What would it take for me to get you to move to another city where you don't speak the language and start waiting tables? Like, if I wanted to send you to Moscow tomorrow to start waiting tables, what would it take?
This is this is amazing. It's funny. It's that's the best question I've had. So I could just do my whole life just a waiter in, and every single book. My situation's radically changed now. Now I'm in my 30s. I have a little boy. See, I would love to do it, but I just couldn't. I couldn't deal with the hours and the sort of poverty, really. That said, I think the idea of, going away somewhere, not necessarily become a poorly treated waiter in a Muscovite restaurant, but, going away, stepping into the unknown and, sort of throwing caution to the winds is something you'll never regret. And I know I get itchy feet a little bit, and, I'm currently in Switzerland, but I'm always thinking, like, where's next? Where we move to next? So it's just it's a question of when, I think. But yeah, I don't think you'll see me as a waiter anytime soon. Probably the waiting industry is probably quite happy about that, to be honest. I was a very, very mediocre waiter at the best of times.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? My second podcast, Don't Miss This, takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Listen now to Don't Miss This on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So I think maybe now it would be nice to hear a little bit from the book.
Yes. It's nice to read something from later in the book, because often I get asked to read stuff at the beginning.
Is there anything we need to know contextually before you read this chapter?
So by this point, it's funny because I'm also looking at a page. At this point, I think I don't know if I'm a waiter yet. I think I'm still a runner. There's been a change in ownership in the restaurant, which means essentially they're sort of cutting down on outgoings and sacking some people, and the quality of the food's going down a little bit. I think the sheen, the sort of charm of the whole experience is wearing a bit thin by this point. We're kind of at the midpoint, actually, aren't we? Yeah, we're very much in the middle of the story. So yeah, I'm sort of asking myself really if should I pull the ejector seat cord and try and phone somebody to lend me some money and try and get back to England. So this chapter, a taste of restaurant life. So the restaurant, much like the city, runs on appearances. The difference between what you see and what you don't is as vast as an ocean. The restaurant, in reality, is a con man. I feel a rising resentment of the restaurant's approach to gastronomy, yet I increasingly admire the waiters, the pride in what they do, their no-nonsense work ethic, the Sisyphean nature of the job, redemption through repetition, the camaraderie, the competition, their relationship with money and the ephemeral, the way they feel part of a great lineage, of something distinctly French, that they, unlike the rest of the citizens of this city, know something special, a secret order of magicians, perhaps, just a lot less glamorous. Because if a waiter is doing his job correctly, he will be manipulating your perception of reality. He is, to all intents and purposes, an illusionist, and his job is to deceive you. He wants you to believe that all is calm and luxurious, because on the other side of that wall, behind that door, is hell. He is, in effect, the living example of the facade. The management are always in a high state of anxiety because for the restaurant to fulfill its role and provide the illusion of luxury that everyone in the dining room expects, the innards must come out of the darkness, across the thin divide and into the world of the living. This puts the restaurant at its most exposed. Everything else happens out of sight. It suffices just to allude to the chef, and the diner will paint the picture themselves, which doubtless does not include a dozen emaciated immigrants being barked at by stressed Tamils or a scimitar-wielding Corsican. The waiters are the weak point in this chain, emissaries from the underworld sent out like yo-yos on the understanding that they will return, and in the meantime play their role and perpetuate the illusion. But a waiter isn't a soldier. As we know, he's a bounty hunter, and the restaurant pays him enough to ensure he can live his itinerant existence, but never enough for him to escape definitively. So he steals and cheats and charms his way to whatever he can get. And this is why you pay him a tip. It's a tax given on the understanding that he will perform his role to the best of his abilities as an actor, bounty hunter, stage manager, bully, and everything else you want him to be so that your food arrives just as you'd expected it. You are paying him so that you get a better service than the other tables. So, don't think that the world behind that door has nothing to do with you. Just like us, you are complicit. Running a restaurant is an exercise in driving down costs while serving the outcome with a straight face. And in Paris, just as in other cities, towns and villages, this is being entrusted to a group of delinquents, men who for whatever reason have fallen into the waiting game. The only way to manage such a situation is to strip each person's role down to its constituent parts. Like engineers in a secret project, no one ever has the whole picture. In the prep kitchen, there are men who are assigned specific dishes. Just on a production line, they will spend their day boiling eggs or toasting bread, while plongeurs wash, cooks are tasked with specific meats the waiter serves. There's a man in the lower kitchen whose job on the weekends is to parboil eggs, hundreds of them, and then lay them on ice so that they can be dropped back into the hot water for a second once another Eggs Benedict is ordered. However, the waiter is unique because he must also have contact with the clientele and, of course, the other important thing, the money. As the service unfolds, the waiter's wallet begins to bulge with takings. Each order has been logged and will be checked off at the end of the day, but until that point, the money is his. A man you pay the minimum wage, the amount that someone has deemed the absolute legal minimum necessary to live in this city, has all the business's money. The waiters are treated with suspicion by every other employee for exactly this reason. But every station has its kickback. You rarely see a cook go hungry, despite the management's best efforts, whereas the waiters must eat what has been rejected by the diners like vultures. I've been in the restaurant a few months now and I have no desire to leave. Not yet, perhaps never. I'm strangely drawn to the world of the waiters. There's something ancient about it, waiting in Paris, with all its rituals. It intrigues me. And I'm slowly being let in, becoming one of them, part of the brotherhood. I want to become a waiter, to have their respect and my own. The prospect of an unpaid London internship, if I was lucky, tasteless supermarket sandwiches in front of a computer for lunch and a return to sofa hopping wouldn't be a patch on living in Paris. Even when you're exhausted, broke, and hungry, there's still an indefinable magic about the place. And no matter how much your feet hurt after a nerve-ending shift, how physically dead you feel as you walk up the Avenue de l'Opéra at night, or across the Seine under the shadow of Notre Dame, inside you can't help but feel intensely alive, because you're in it, you're in the film, you're not watching, you've got a walk-on speaking part and everything that feels possible. Besides, when you're in Paris, you couldn't care less about anywhere else. Your world shrinks. It's the center of the universe. There is no one else.
So what's next for you? Are you working on another book?
Yeah, I'm actually currently writing the film for this book. So yeah, that's sort of happening. Should actually hit the screener in the future. I've got to finish the screenplay. So that's exciting. And then, yes, I've got a second book to write. I've got a couple of things, a non-fiction and a fiction project. It's just about getting my organization and time right to get it all done. But hopefully I'll start the planning stages, but I'm hoping to start the non-fiction book in the very near future.
How exciting. All right. So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm terrible at this, but I have an Instagram account, so feel free to follow me. I try and respond to messages as well, so if you do send me messages. I also have my website, which is edwardchisholm.com. Pretty simple, and via that you can send me messages as well, and I can respond. And then I think I don't have a Twitter as well. I do have a Twitter. I think I probably have the lowest followers on Twitter, but it's there in case. And yeah, that's probably the best way. And then should be able to stay up to date with anything I'm up to. Instagram probably, I think, is probably the easiest one. I'm starting to get the hang of that.
Okay, well, I'll include links to everything so that people can find you.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you again to Edward Chisholm for such a compelling conversation. You can find Edward at Edward_Chisholm_ on Instagram, on Twitter at ChisholmEdward, and on his website, edwardchisholm.com. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with author Eva Stachniak about her book, The School of Mirrors. Check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. Please remember to rate and review us and also tell a friend. The more people who know about this podcast, the more we'll be able to grow and the more I'll be able to share fabulous books and their authors with you. Join the Storytime Book Club, which welcomes authors who have been featured on the podcast to come talk more in depth about their books. Since we keep the podcast spoiler-free, this is the perfect chance to get all your specific questions answered. Please visit patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio for more information. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and until next week, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.